These convicts seemingly defied the odds and survived what should have been the ultimate punishment, death, in crazy ways. From one execution style to another, one would wonder if these convicts knew while on death row that life itself would dish them a second chance despite being condemned to slow and painful deaths. John Half-Hinged Smith. John Smith earned himself notoriety as a London housebreaker who evaded execution 3 times too many. Born to a Malton farmer in 1661, Smith served the Navy first in a merchantman, then in a man-of-war, and was discharged after the Battle of Vigo Bay. He soon enlisted as a soldier and met the bad eggs that helped him launch his career as a housebreaker. The native of New Yorkshire was first caught in 1705. Of 4 indictments, Smith was convicted of 2 on the 5th of December and sentenced to death. As though a magician or in possession of some kind of extra life, he did not care that he was sentenced to die. He was slated to be hanged on Christmas Eve of the same year, and as the day arrived, was taken to the gallows of the Manor Estate, Tyburn, in the county of Middlesex, England. His executioners suspended him and waited with a plethora of people, including Smith's family and friends, for him to die. But Smith wouldn't die and continued to struggle. Some people began to tug at his legs to help him die quickly and shorten his suffering. They eventually turned around and held up his legs to save him, as he just wouldn't die. Smith was suspended for 15 minutes until the people demanded a reprieve. The reprieve was granted and Smith was cut down and taken to a nearby house where he recovered and earned himself the name that stuck with him forever, Half-Hanged Smith. He was asked what he felt during his failed execution, and he replied saying, "I remember a great pain caused by the weight of my body. My spirits were in a great uproar, pushing upwards. When they got into my head, I saw a great blaze of glaring light that seemed to go out of my head in a flash. Then the pain went. When I was cut down, I got such pins and needles pains in my head that I could have hanged the people who set me free." He was set free on the 20th of February 1706, and you'd think he'd turn a new leaf, but he resumed housebreaking and was caught yet again. Following a series of weird events, the jury decided to leave the verdict of his second conviction to 12 judges, and these judges acquitted Smith. Smith, apparently growing smug at his evasion of justice, continued in his ways and was captured for a 3rd time. Surely there'd be no hope for John Half-Hanged Smith this time, the people thought, and he'd be executed once and for all. The prosecutor in his case, however, died a day before his trial, and Smith was once again a free man. In 1727, at the age of 66, Smith, under the alias of John Wilson, was caught for the 4th time as he tried to steal a padlock. His accomplice escaped, but Smith was clearly too old to outrun the police. He was found guilty of theft, and this time around the judge decided he would be sentenced to transportation to Virginia, United States, ending his streak of getaways. The exiled thief appealed his sentence to Sir John Isles Knight, requesting for physical punishment so he could maybe survive again. The court took no pity on him, and in spite of his physical disabilities and role as a father to 2 children, he was finally transported to Virginia in July of 1727 on the convict voyage, Susanna. Wenceslao Moguel. Wenceslao Moguel Herrera was born on the 1st of November 1896 in Mérida, Yucatan, Mexico. He was a soldier and served under the famous revolutionary Pancho Villa during the Mexican Revolution that lasted between 1910 and 1920. Pancho Villa was defeated in 1915 by the Constitutionalists, who were known as the Federales, and this instantly spelt doom for all of Villa's followers. The regional de facto armies pursued Villa's loyalists, who were rather powerful in northern Mexico, and executed them on the flimsiest of allegations. On the 18th of March, 1915, Moguel was one of such revolutionaries to be captured. Only 25 years old, he was branded a traitor and sentenced to death by Colonel Ortiz the same day he was captured. Ortiz sentenced him to execution by a firing squad without a trial. Death by a firing squad was the popular means of execution during the Mexican Revolution. The squad was made of 10 soldiers, 9 of whom would line up and fire their weapons at the same time. The 10th officer was there to deliver what was known as the coup de grace, or the kill shot. Moguel was positioned and the Federales took their positions, ready to send Moguel to his creator. The 9 men fired shots into Moguel's body, aiming at his vital organs, and the 10th officer delivered the kill shot to his head at point-blank range to ensure he was dead and left him there to rot. Moguel survived 10 devastating shots and played dead despite the excruciating pain so that the Federales would assume he was dead. He then crawled 3 blocks away from the scene and went to the Church of St. James Apostle, where he was found and taken care of until he recovered. recovered. Some sources claim that he was found lying unconscious among the dead bodies of his comrades and nursed back to health afterward. Whatever the tale, Moguel survived death by a firing squad and was rightly dubbed El Fusilado, meaning the shot one. He was disfigured for life from this incident, but he lived a normal life after his recovery. He even appeared on the radio show of Robert L. Ripley called Ripley's Believe It or Not on July 16, 1937, at Cleveland, Ohio. He was also made the subject of a song titled El Fusilado by the British anarchist band Chumbawamba. He lived his life to the fullest and died on the 29th of July, 1976, at the age of 79. William Duel. The story of William Duel sounds like nothing less than an old English tale about, yet again, surviving the gallows. Duel was born in 1723, and when only 17 years old when he was convicted of being an accessory to the rape of Sarah Griffin in Acton, London. In September 1740, Sarah Griffin embarked on a journey back home to rural Worcestershire from London due to her declining health. On her way, she met Duel, who was a farmer's lad at a barn in Acton. Duel offered to give Griffin a place to stay for the night, and she agreed. After Griffin retired to her bed of hay, Duel went out and boasted to 5 men about knowing the whereabouts of a young woman traveling alone. The 5 men attacked Sarah and launched a series of attacks that can only be described as heinous. According to press reader, Sarah tried to defend herself by crying out that she was poxed, but the attackers paid zero heed to this information. She was assaulted multiple times, beaten terribly, and even robbed. Sarah died the next day whilst undergoing treatment by a local surgeon. Young Duel was blamed as the main culprit because he was the one who had let the other men know about Sarah's whereabouts. The judge overlooked the fact that Duel was a minor and sentenced him to death by hanging. The court recorder noted that Duel, with tears in his eyes, acknowledged himself guilty of rape, robbery, and murder. On November 24, 1740, he was hanged in Tyburn along with 4 others. Duel reportedly hung for 20 minutes before his body was cut down. He was then taken to the Anatomy Theater at the Worshipful Company of Barbers and Surgeons to be dissected for medical study purposes. He was stripped and laid on a board, ready to be anatomized until one of the servants noticed that he had begun breathing slowly. His breath soon picked up and became faster. He was then bled, and shortly after could sit upright without any support. Duel was taken back to prison that night and upon questioning, stated that he didn't even remember being hanged. He suffered from a fever and delirium during his trial and execution, and people suggested that this terrible state ultimately saved his life. He was back to normal the next day, as though he hadn't just cheated death at the gallows. The public soon heard about his survival, and there was widespread excitement about dead-alive Duel. His sentence was eventually changed, and he was exiled to Boston, Massachusetts, America, where he lived and died in his 80s. Alireza, a 37-year-old man in his right senses identified simply as Alireza M, was caught smuggling crystal meth into Iran in 2013. The same year, Amnesty International claimed that Iranian authorities executed 508 people, with the majority connected to drug offenses. Needless to say that it didn't take a long debate for a revolutionary court to find Alireza guilty and sentence him to death. On the cool autumn morning of Wednesday, October 9th of the same year, Alireza was transported from his cell in Bojnerd prison, located in Iran's northern Khorasan province, to be hanged. Before the sun greeted the earth on that day, Alireza was hanged and left to die. After being suspended for 12 minutes, he was certified dead, cut down, and sent to the morgue for his family to claim his body. The next morning, a worker was preparing his supposedly lifeless body for collection by his family and discovered that there was some kind of condensation in the plastic cover used to wrap his body. This indicated that Alireza was still alive and, in fact, breathing. He was rushed instantly to Bojnerd's Imam Ali Hospital, where medics began treatment to restore him back to health. Authorities brought this to the attention of the judge that condemned Alireza for possessing a kilo of crystal meth, and the judge determined that he was to be put to death again once medical staff confirm his health condition is good enough. Because in Iran, convicts should be conscious and relatively healthy before execution. Hanging is delayed for people who are pregnant or in a coma. The Iranian government soon received heat for this decision, but they stood their ground, stating that Alireza was sentenced to death and not to hang, and since he was still alive, the sentence had not been fulfilled. Mohammed Erfan, a judge with Iran's Administrative Justice Court, told Jammy Jam, "The sentence issued by the Revolutionary Court is the death penalty. In such circumstances, it should be repeated once again." The case garnered international attention, and various human rights groups called against the re-execution of Alireza Alireza. Amnesty International's Philip Luther said the move to hang him again betrayed a basic lack of humanity. According to CNN, Alireza survived hanging and then survived a judicial review. Iran's Justice Minister Mostafapour Mohammadi told the nation's official news agency IRNA that the convict would not be executed again. Alireza not only survived the ropes but was granted a reprieve at a time when Iran laws against drugs were considered the strictest. Zolleika K. On the 11th of August 1997, Zolleika K, an Iranian national, was arrested and charged with engaging in extramarital sexual relations. She was immediately condemned to death by the decree of the religious magistrate at the time, Hakim Shar, and fully supported by the Friday prayer leader of Ali Abad village, Khalifzadeh. In cases of adultery, when a person is sentenced to death, the preferred method of execution is death by stoning. The individual is buried in a hole, a man to his waist and a woman, sometimes to her chest. They are then pelted with rocks until they no longer breathe. Kadkota was taken on that same day to a field and was buried from her waist down in a ditch by civilian supporters of the Islamic regime in conjunction with the local Pasdaran and Basijis. They began stoning Kadkota mercilessly until outraged villagers rallied and stopped them from attacking the half-buried woman. She received severe injuries to her head and face. The villagers immediately dug her out and rushed her to the nearby Buchan hospital. News of the pelting spread quickly and was met with great shock and disapproval among the people of the city and the villages of Buchan. The local authorities bent to pressure and promised to grant Kadkota amnesty if she survived, or so the people thought. Rumors had it that they in fact still had plans to stone her a second time. Various human rights bodies weighed in heavily on the matter. In one letter captioned, "Action Request by the World Organization Against Torture, OMCT," the body requested that Kadkota be granted total amnesty following her full recovery. It is also important to note that under Iranian law, when someone is sentenced to death by stoning in Iran, for instance in extramarital cases, if they by any means climb out of the ground after being buried up to the neck or by a stroke of chance survive the ordeal, their life is spared. In a document released by Amnesty International on May 14, 1998, the Iranian authorities stated that the death sentence against Zolleika K had been lifted and that she was released on the 26th of November 1997. This brought the reign of terror on Kadkota's life to an end and paved the way for her name to enter the books of those that cheated the death penalty. Greene. Greene was a domestic servant who was accused of committing infanticide in 1650. If you haven't already guessed it, Greene survived the English gallows too. Greene was born sometime in 1628 in the cozy town of Steeple Barton, Oxfordshire. When she became an adult, she began working as a scullery maid at the house of a man named Sir Thomas Reed. Being a scullery maid meant Greene only worked as assistant to other maids and remained one of the lowest ranked in Sir Thomas's household. Woes began for 22-year-old Greene when she became pregnant for Sir Thomas's teen grandson, Geoffrey Reed. Greene claimed that she was seduced by Geoffrey Reed and that she had no knowledge of the pregnancy until she had a miscarriage in her 17th week. She tried to hide the remains of the underdeveloped fetus, but she was caught and accused of infanticide. Her boss pressed charges and insisted that she was guilty under Act 1624 of the English law, which held a legal presumption that a woman who concealed the death of her illegitimate child had murdered it. Despite the testimonies from an experienced midwife and from Greene's co-workers that she did not intentionally kill the child, Greene was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. She requested that a few of her friends be present at her execution, to pull her swinging legs perhaps to hasten the death. On the 14th of December 1650, Greene was hanged at Oxford Castle, and while her friends tugged at her legs, a soldier struck her at least 4 times with the bottom of his musket to hasten her death. After hanging for 30 minutes, everyone present concluded that Greene was dead, and so she was cut down and sent to physicians at the University of Oxford to be anatomized. The 2 physicians, William Petty and Thomas Willis, upon examining Greene, discovered that she had a faint pulse and was breathing weakly. They immediately alerted their other colleagues who joined in to try to save Greene. The group of 4 physicians tried many remedies, including a tobacco smoke enema. Greene was then laid next to another warm to keep her warm. She quickly regained her health and even started to speak after 12 to 14 hours. In 30 days, Greene was not only alive, but 100% well saved for memory loss about the time surrounding her execution. Sir Thomas Reed passed 3 days after Greene's execution, and so when she was granted a reprieve, there was no prosecutor to object to the decision. The authorities believed that the hand of God had saved her to prove her innocence, and so granted her a pardon. Greene took her coffin with her as a keepsake when she left to stay with friends in the country. She eventually got married, had 3 children, and died in 1659. Willie Francis. Young Willie Francis experienced gruesome Gertie, Louisiana's notorious electric chair, 2 times, surviving the horrific experience once and giving in on the second attempt. Francis, who became known as the Black Teenager who was executed twice, was only 17 when he was arrested. He was arrested in Texas City on suspicion of peddling drugs with another drug dealer simply because he was carrying a briefcase and speaking with a stutter. He was only visiting his sister who lived in Port Arthur, but the police detained him anyway. They were unable to connect him to the dealer and soon began to grill him about the murder of Cajun pharmacist Andrew Thomas. Thomas had been shot and killed 16 months earlier in St. Martinville, Louisiana. Sources claim that the sheriff, E.L. Resweber, had called upon the chief of police in Port Arthur to arrest any man so they could close the case, and young Francis, who was 15 at the time, was the unlucky scapegoat. Within minutes of his arrest, there was already a signed confession by Francis claiming he had killed Thomas in November of 1944. The next day, a second confession was released. He was immediately charged to court, and in 3 weeks, Francis was standing in the presence of a grand jury of 12 white men. He pleaded not guilty to the charges. The police alleged that Francis was found carrying the dead man's wallet during the time of his arrest, but no evidence of this was presented in court. The murder weapon was linked to Deputy Sheriff Auguste Fuselier, who had in fact threatened to kill Andrew Thomas, but they claimed Francis had stolen the gun. Police alleged that Francis was found carrying the dead man's wallet during the time of his arrest, but no evidence of this was presented in court. The murder weapon was linked to Deputy Sheriff Auguste Fuselier, who had in fact threatened to kill Andrew Thomas, but they claimed Francis had stolen the gun. No evidence of this too ever made it to court. Despite the flimsy case by the prosecution, his appointed defense attorneys did absolutely nothing to defend him, and he was quickly found guilty and sentenced to death by the electric chair. On May 3, 1946, Francis was driven almost 10 miles and past his childhood home from his courthouse jail cell to be electrocuted. He was strapped to the gruesome Gertie, and the switch was flicked on. Unknown to everyone present, the portable electric chair has been set up incorrectly by a drunk prison guard and his assistant, who was an inmate. Witnesses reported hearing Francis screaming at the executioners to take it off, let me breathe," from underneath the leather hood. He survived the execution as the surge of current was not enough to kill him, even though it left him bald. Francis's father then sought the services of defense attorney Bertrand DeBlanc, who fought tooth and nail to prevent a re-execution. DeBlanc, who had been best friends with the late Thomas, took the case to the U.S. Supreme Court, and even though the re-execution was prohibited by the Constitution, the Supreme Court rejected his appeal. DeBlanc then commenced proceedings to have Francis's conviction overturned, but the discouraged teenager, who was now 18, had lost all hope and persuaded his attorney to quit just a few days to his scheduled second execution. On the 9th of May, 1947, a little over a year after his botched execution, Willie Francis sat in the electric chair again. Willie, who told reporter Elliot Chase a few days prior that he was going to meet the Lord with his Sunday pants and Sunday heart, was pronounced dead 10 minutes past noon. Doyle Ham. Doyle Lee Ham was an American criminal that was sentenced to death in 1987 for the murder of Patrick Cunningham, a man he killed during a robbery. Ham was born the 10th of 12 children in February of 1957 into a family crime. Ham's father and his 6 elder brothers had all spent time in jail. One of Ham's sisters stated that their father always told them that if they didn't go out to steal, then they were not Hams, so no prizes for guessing. By the time Doyle Ham was a full adult, he had had several run-ins with the law for burglary, assault, and even grand larceny. He met his Waterloo after going on a crime spree on the 24th of January 1987, which ended in the murder of Patrick Cunningham at a motel in Cullman, Alabama. Cunningham was a nighttime clerk at the motel. He died from a single gunshot wound to his temple from the pistol Ham had also stolen in Mississippi during his spree that day. Ham stole $350 from the motel's cash register and $60 from Cunningham's wallet before fleeing the scene. He was detained the following day in Cullman and charged with capital murder, making him instantly eligible for the death penalty. Ham's trial was a roller coaster ride. His defense attorneys failed to properly lay out his defense despite being aware that tests revealed that he suffered from fetal alcohol syndrome and had an IQ of 66. By 1999, another hearing was held to review his claims that his defense attorney did a terrible job at his first trial 12 years earlier. Ham was diagnosed with lymphatic and cranial cancer in early 2014. While still on death row and amidst his ongoing court cases, he underwent strenuous treatment, and despite his condition, the Alabama Supreme Court Court set his execution date for Thursday, February 22, 2018. Chief Judge Beaudry ordered an independent medical examination of Ham to determine if he was in a condition to accept the lethal injection. The medical examination found that Ham's arms and hands were unusable, but his lower extremities were usable. Several bodies and his defense attorney spoke against this, stating that the attempt would only cause the terminally ill man injuries. The state of Alabama proceeded nonetheless. During the execution, correctional officers spent 2.5 hours poking at Ham's legs and ankles with needles trying to find a vein. The execution team even turned him on his stomach and slapped the back of his legs in an attempt to find a usable vein. When they couldn't find any vein, the executioners proceeded to callously insert needles into Ham's groin, desperately searching for a vein. Ham was stabbed so many times with needles that his bladder and femoral artery were punctured. He bled enough to soak up the gurney on which he lay with his blood. The execution was then called, and Ham became the fourth person in American history since 1946 to walk out of the execution chamber still alive, even though he buckled as soon as he got up due to the extent of his injuries. Ham and the state of Alabama eventually reached an agreement that ensured that he would no longer be executed. Ham later died from cancer-related complications while in prison at 64. Ramel Broome. Ramel Broome lived a life riddled with crime. He spent his years committing first non-violent crimes and later dangerous crimes, including robbery. In 1975, he raped a 12-year-old girl who was babysitting his niece, and just 2 months later, committed an armed robbery. He was arrested and charged for rape, aggravated robbery, and robbery. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 7 to 25 years in prison. Broome was released on parole on the 11th of May, 1984. Broome tried to kidnap 12-year-old Vanita McKinney on September 18, 1984, but was stopped by 2 neighbors before running away. Broome then kidnapped and killed 14-year-old Trina Middleton 2 days later on September 21, 1984, as she was returning home from a football game in East Cleveland, Ohio with 2 of her friends. In December of the same year, Broome attempted to kidnap 11-year-old Melinda Grissom, physically assaulting her in the process. Grissom's mother held onto his car and screamed at the top of her lungs for help. Thanks to the icy road, Broome could not speed away, and Grissom's mother held on. The terrified young girl was able to escape, and 2 men wrote down the license plate number of Broome's car. Broome was arrested later that day and charged with his horrific crimes, including the aggravated murder of 14-year-old Middleton. He offered to plead guilty for a sentence of 30 years to life, but his offer was rejected. He was instead found guilty and sentenced to death by lethal injection. On September 15, 2009, Ramel Broome was laid out on a gurney, and his executioners began the process of administering the lethal drugs into his veins. They tried for 2 hours to find venous entry on his person, but were unsuccessful. This attempt was called off, and he was granted a 1-week reprieve. Broome has been punctured 18 different times during this attempt. The state's authority to try to carry out his execution a second time was subsequently disputed by Broome, who said that doing so would violate the Constitution's prohibition on endangering someone's life twice. In a 4-3 decision on March 16, 2016, the Ohio Supreme Court dismissed his appeals and authorized the state to attempt his execution. His subsequent execution was initially scheduled for June 17, 2020, but was then moved to March 16, 2022. The battle of shoulds and shoulds came to an end on the 28th of December, 2020, as Ramel Broome died from suspected COVID-19 complications at Franklin Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio, age 64. John Babacom Lee. John Henry George Babacom Lee was a Victorian-era Englishman who became known as the man that could not be hanged after he survived 3 attempts at the gallows in mysterious circumstances. Lee, a notorious thief who was born in Abbotsford, Devon, served in the Royal Navy before he began serving as footman and gardener for Emma Keyes at her residence, the Glen on Babacom Bay. Keyes was found brutally murdered on Saturday, November 15, 1884. She had a fractured skull and a slashed throat. The attacker had set her body and different parts of her house on fire. Lee was arrested based on circumstantial evidence, as people believed that he either committed the crime, was involved in covering it up, or was the arsonist. The prosecutors accused Lee of killing his employer because she had reduced his already poor wage. As is common with the others in this list, Lee received inadequate legal representation and told lies while still maintaining that he was innocent. Lee was found guilty and sentenced to death. Justice Manistee, the presiding judge, observed Lee's calmness as his sentence was read, and Lee replied to his comments saying, "Please, my lord, allow me to to say that I am so calm because I trust in my Lord, and he knows that I am innocent. He was scheduled to die at the gallows on the 23rd of February, 1885. He woke up on that fateful day and told the two warders that were with him that he had dreamt that the executioner tried without success to hang him, owing to a broken scaffold. As the mask was placed over his face, he reportedly looked towards the sky, remaining calm. The lever that would suspend Lee was then pulled, but it refused to work. The executioner tried again with two prison warders helping him by stamping on the platform. Still, the lever refused to work. Lee was removed from the platform, and when the hanging setup was tried, it worked without issues. He was returned, and as they tried to hang him the second time, the apparatus refused to work yet again. They removed him yet again and tested the apparatus, and it worked just fine. They tried for the third time to execute him, but as they pulled and stomped on the boards only made squeaky sounds but remained rigidly jammed in place. Eventually, Lee was escorted back to his cell, and news of his survival became a frenzy. The Home Secretary then overturned his condition and sentenced him to life in prison. The people believed that the failure of the equipment to work 3 times meant Lee may have been innocent after all. Lee was released in 1907 after serving only 22 years. He went ahead to get married, bear 2 children, and spend his life exhibiting himself to earn some money. Mysterious or not, surviving execution would have been nothing but a myth if these individuals had not somehow defied death. Watch more spine-chilling videos like this by clicking right here.